So, first of all, the program. So, I'm going to do an overview about several topics, and in most of the topics, what we are going to do is the following. Remind you about the situation with some detail in some cases in the 14-20 programming period, and then to tell you what are the main changes for the post-2020 programming period. We will start with sampling methodology in general. What are the sampling methods that are available? Remind you these, and what are the foreseen changes. Still in the related to the sampling methods, I'll address what we have called the simplified sampling methodology, which is also a novelty in the new programming period. And then still in this line of general statistical methods, we will zoom non-statistical sampling because it's of particular interest and it has some methodological changes for the post-2020 period. And then I will start talking about more, let's say, transversal topics like unilateral testing, which is relevant in combination with any sampling methodology, regional clustering, which is something that is starting to appear at this moment. Some audit authorities start to use it, and it can be extremely useful. A topic that we believe it's very relevant and it will be addressed in some detail, technical detail. It's subsampling with simplified cost options. And in the sequence of that, we will talk about technical assistance, both in the current programming period and in the future. And then we will end with two also complex topics, which is the topic related with the proportionality of controls that until now we have designated by proportional control arrangements. It is mostly known for as single audit arrangements. And finally, we will end the topics with the financial instruments. Okay, guys, so first of all, so just one slide before we start with the content. We have just this for each topic, this special focus about the post-2020 changes, and of course, related with this also some of the things we have called off-the-shelf methodologies, which is basically the methodologies that we have placed in the Delegated Act. We are not going in this presentation to give you technical details of the sampling methods, formulas, things like this, but of course you can always ask for technical details during the presentation. So, regarding sampling methods, what is the situation? As many of you surely remember, during many years during this programming period, we have used a document called the Guidance Note on Sampling Methods for Audit Authorities. This document will still exist in the future. This document is very important because it offers you lots of technical details and examples that you cannot find in the legislation, of course, in the Delegated Act. And in this guidance note, we have proposed several years ago, basically, let's say, 4 or 5 families of methods. We have proposed a methodology that we have called simple random sampling that included, in fact, two methodologies in practice, because, as you probably remember, includes both mean per unit estimation and ratio estimation, which are 2 totally different methods to project the errors that can adapt to different situations about the characteristics of the population. We have also proposed difference estimation. We have included in this guidance note MUS in a format that we a format that we designated by conservative. Conservative in the sense that it was the traditional way to perform MUS, and also conservative in the sense that, as many of you know, it's a methodology that typically produces larger sample sizes than the new variant of MUS that we have introduced in this guidance note. When we have written the guidance note, we have designed this new version of MUS that we have decided to call standard or customized MUS. And over the years, I could say this has turned to be the dominant methodology. And I would say that presently, two things happened. One, most or even all the audit authorities have moved from conservative MUS to standard MUS for reasons related with the possibility to have smaller sample sizes, but also the flexibility of the methods. During yesterday, for the ones of you that were here yesterday, I remind you that conservative MUS has more restrictions in terms of its application than standard MUS. For example, conservative MUS cannot be applied if you expect to be above materiality or even close to materiality. Also, a second thing that you have seen during the last years is that most of the audit authorities that were using in the past difference estimation have moved from difference estimation to simple random sampling. So I would say that under statistical sampling, simple random sampling and standard MUS have become the two most used method among all the audit authorities, and difference estimation and conservative MUS have lost the traditional power and are almost not used at all in the present days. Also in the guidance note, we have by that time introduced some methodologies allowing you to implement non-statistical sampling, both based on probability proportional to size and equal probability selection. As many of you remember, just to tell you, make this clear, non-statistical sampling with equal probability basically mimics simple random sampling, and non-statistical sampling with probability proportional to expenditure basically mimics MUS. So they are, let's say, lighter versions of simple random sampling and of MUS without the need to calculate precision, without the need to calculate the upper error limit, but the selection of the sample itself and the projection is made exactly in the same way as in the statistical methods counterpart of these two non-statistical methods. And of course, needless to say, these are the base methods, but in the guidance note, for every method, we have introduced variations, including stratification, including multi-period approaches, and also including the combination between stratification and multi-period approaches. So this is basically the framework where you work today. Now, for the post-2020, and in particularly in the context of the off-the-shelf approaches that we have included in the Delegated Act, and because these are really the two dominant methods, simple random sampling and multi-unit sampling, what we have just included in this list of off-the-shelf methodologies, these two methods, simple random sampling and standard MUS. Also, under this off-the-shelf methodology designation, we have also included, of course, the stratified and multi-period variations of these two methods. So, in a sense, we have reduced the list of methods that are covered in these off-the-shelf sampling methodologies. Again, as you know, they are already published in this delegated regulation. But first of all, it is very important to state the following. The methodologies that are in this off-the-shelf list or in this delegated regulation do not limit at all the application of other sampling methodologies. So if you'd still like to use other methodologies that were available in the guidance note on sampling, and even more, if you'd like to use other methodologies that are not in the guidance note on sampling, but are acceptable statistical methodologies that you can apply in the context of audit, of course, you are absolutely allowed to continue to use other different methodologies. So what's the advantage? To restrict your methodologies to what is prescribed in this off-the-shelf list? Well, it's obvious. The methods included in the Act have an advantage. Have an advantage of now being no more just a guidance, but having this character of a regulation. And of course, this probably better defends you in the sense that you will have a legal basis, and there is a presumption that whatever you do that is covered in this off-the-shelf list will, of course, be in line with the requirements. The delegated regulation, as you know, was published already in January the 10th, and it's about to enter into force by the end of this month. Answering your questions, I see here a question from John Collins. Answering your question, yes, we can already make you available the presentation. Okay, you already have a copy of the presentation. Now, another additional simplification. Not only we have reduced the list of sampling methodologies that are included in this off-the-shelf list, but also in what regards one of the methods, which is simple random sampling, we also have in this line of simplification in the context of the delegated regulation, we have also included just one extrapolation method. Again, the idea is the same. We have included ratio estimation as the basic extrapolation method, both, of course, for simple random sampling, but also for non-statistical with equal probability selection, because as I just stated, non-statistical with equal probability selection is just a simplified version of simple random sampling, so the extrapolation method should be the same. Ratio estimation is now set in the legislation. What does it mean? Well, it means in practice the following. If you decide to use ratio estimation, no additional evidence or explanations are required to support this choice. You remember that in the past, we have proposed two projection methods, mean per unit and ratio estimation, and there were conditions to apply one or the other. If the condition would be fulfilled, you should apply ratio estimation. If the condition would not be fulfilled, you should apply mean per unit estimation. Now, if you decide to use ratio estimation, you don't need to prove the condition of applicability of this extrapolation methodology. If you still would like to use mean per unit estimation or even other estimation methods that are not even foreseen in the guidance note, of course that you can still do it. And by the way, there will be situations where mean per unit estimation continues to be recommendable, more recommendable than ratio estimation. There are situations where we can prove that mean per unit estimation offers much better quality of results than ratio estimation. And in these cases, if you would like to use it, you are extremely welcome to do so. But in that case, you have to do what you already have done in this ending programming period, which is you have to give evidence about the favorable conditions to apply this methodology. So in practical terms, if you decide to use mean per unit, you still do what you have done until now, which is to prove that it's the best method. If you decide to use ratio estimation, you don't need to offer this proof. This is the only difference, but the two extrapolation methodologies continue to be welcomed. What else can we tell you about the post-2020 sampling methods? In terms of subsampling, no changes as compared to the current rules are foreseen. So you continue to be able to use subsampling, of course, or better said, two-stage sampling. You still need at the second level of sampling to follow principles that will allow you to extrapolate the results to the main sampling unit. So if you have as main sampling unit an operation and as secondary sampling unit invoices, you have to have a methodology that will allow you to project the errors from the invoices into the operation, and then in the second stage to project the errors from the operation to the population. So you have, let's say, two stages. When selecting the sample, you go top down, you select the operations and then the invoices within the operations. When you project the errors, you go bottom up. You project the errors from the invoices into the operation and then from the operation into the population. Danielle Fall, can we still refer to guidelines of sampling methods and guidelines on subsampling in the audit strategy of the new funding period? Yes, I'm sure you can. If I'm wrong, please someone from DAC can correct me, but of course you are very much welcome to do so. Again, as I said, the delegated act does not limit at all your freedom to use any sampling methodologies, and everything that is written in the guidance note is still valid. The only thing that we are offering now is, let's say, a subset of these methods. We cannot put them all there. So we have selected a subset of the methods that are mostly used. And for this subset of methods, we have given them a legal basis and this presumption of being correct, but you can act as before and make any relationships with the guidelines. Now, about subsampling, okay? I would like to remind you about the general ideas in subsampling, because these general ideas will still apply for the post-2020. So we are still in this framework of doing a broad overview of the available sampling methods, and within subsampling, we still apply the same principles. What are the principles? The subsampling strategy, and by subsampling I mean sampling within the primary sampling unit, very often the operation. The subsampling strategy continues to have to be always statistical, unless the sampling of the operations is not itself statistical. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, I already told to some of you this yesterday. For simplicity of language, I will very often say the operations, knowing of course that the primary sampling units, sometimes it's not the operation, maybe the project or the payment claim, but for simplicity of language, instead of saying primary sampling unit, which is very long, I will say the operation. So let's say, unless the sampling of the operations is itself non-statistical, if the subsampling within the operation, whatever are the subsampling units, invoices, expenditure items, whatever, this subsampling also has to be statistical. Secondly, even if we are in the framework of non-statistical sampling, as many of you know, the probabilistic selection of the sampling units is still mandatory. This applies not only to the units in the main sample, but also to the units in the subsample. So even if you are in the context of non-statistical sampling, it's still true that you have to select the invoices using random numbers, either with equal probabilities like in simple random sampling, or with probability proportional to expenditure like in MUS. The available methods for subsampling are the same that are available for the main sample, but again, for the new programming period and based on these off-the-shelf methodologies, the two methods that have this legal basis are standard MUS and simple random sampling. So again, these are the two that bear this presumption of being in line with all the requirements. But again, if you prefer to use other statistical subsampling methods, you are perfectly welcome to do so. The only thing is that you have to justify that this method is adequate for your population. Okay, but all the available sampling methods are also available at the subsampling level. Some additional principles. Of course, you are going to tell me that this is almost needless to say, but of course that we all know that only the expenditure of the secondary units, again, for simplicity of language, I may say invoices, only the expenditure of the invoices or secondary units, whatever they are, that are selected to the subsample is audited. It's not the full audit or expenditure of the operation, it's just the expenditure of these units. This means that in the ACRs, the audited expenditure is only the one that was in fact selected to the sample and to the subsampling, and not the whole expenditure of the operation. Another general principle that was already true for the previous programming period, and it will continue to be true for the future. The errors that you find in subsamples have to be projected to the operation. This subsample is always used as a tool to estimate the error of the operation. We use the subsample as an instrument. The subsample is just an intermediate step to try to approximate as accurately as possible what is the level of error of the operation. This means that in general, all the errors that you find within the operation in the context of a subsample should be treated as random errors that have to be projected. They should not, in general, have other kind of treatment. For example, you should not treat them as a systemic error, unless, of course, they are really part of a systemic error, and in fact, you are able to do the full delimitation of this error in the whole population, not only within this operation, but in the whole population. But otherwise, this is the way to proceed, is to treat all the errors that you find in subsamples as random errors and project them. If you find yourself in situations where you would like to consider other types of errors like systemic errors or known errors or whatever in the context of subsampling, I would advise that please contact the Commission in order to see if this is possible in this context. But in general terms, let's think about these errors as random errors. So the general idea about subsampling is this one that I already told you about, which is you have, let's imagine a population. These rectangles are, imagine, operations. You select a sample of operations, and within the operations, you select a sample of, for instance, invoices. But in the context of multi-stage sampling, you can even have more layers, as you probably, or more stages, better said, as you probably know. You may select here operations, and then project partners, and then expenditure items within the project partners. There are many different combinations that are possible in this context. The important thing is the following. As I said in the first slide, when you select the sample, we go top down. Let's select the sample of operations. Within each operation, I select the subsample of invoices. But then when you project the errors, we do the inverse chain, which is bottom up, use this subsample to project the errors of the operations, and then to use the sample of the operations to project the error of the school population. Now, something that was relevant for the ending programming period, but will also be relevant for the future, for new programming period, which is how to choose the method in the second stage. Now we know that all the methods are available, but let's say the two ones that are in the off-the-shelf list are MUS and simple random sampling. First of all, very important to say, at the second stage, you can apply any method that you'd like, that you consider, of course, to be adequate for that population. And very importantly, it is not necessary to use at the second stage the same method that you have used for the first stage of sampling. This means that you may have decided to select the operations with MUS, and then you can decide to select the invoices with simple random sampling, for example, or any other combination. Or to select the operations with MUS and to select the invoices with stratified simple random sampling. So all the methods and variations, including stratification and multivariate approaches, will be available. As for the first stage of sampling, it is also possible to apply stratification at the second stage. Is it relevant? Yes. Is it as relevant as for the first stage? Probably not. I mean, usually the stratification of the operations has a more preeminent impact on the quality of the results than the stratification of the expenditure items at the second stage. But it still can help, and it still can be advisable to use this stratification at the second stage. So you can stratify, for example, the expenditure items by 2 or 3 categories of expenditure. Many of you have this experience, for instance, I don't know, in ESF, where you know that there are some categories of expenditure like salaries that have different levels of risk when compared to other categories of expenditure. So in this case, may make completely sense to stratify by the categories of expenditure. So the categories for stratification are completely based on your professional judgment. You can use the value of the items, the type of expenditure, the category. To be honest, the rules for deciding about the stratification are the same as for the main sample, which is you should consider criteria that you believe, based on your professional judgment, historical data, pilot samples, or whatever, that you believe that will help to explain the level of error in the population. If you consider that there are 2 categories of expenditure, and one of them usually generates less errors than the others, then it makes sense to stratify by category of expenditure. If you consider that high-value invoices usually have larger or smaller errors than low-value invoices, then it makes sense to stratify by the value of the invoice, and so on. What is important is to find criteria that helps to explain the level of error. Within subsampling, it is in fact very typical to try to identify different categories of expenditure with different risks. So situations where you expect that the level of error may vary significantly among categories of expenditure within the operation. In that situation, this stratification may be very efficient. What about sample size? As you know, for the future, the minimum sample size for statistical sampling continues to be 30. So no news about this. So you have still to calculate the sample size adequately. In the previous programming period, we have already offered you this methodology where you could calculate the sample sizes in 2 stages. In the first stage, you would calculate the sample size at the level of the main sample. Let's call it the level of the operations. You have some formulas formulas for MUS, formulas for simple random sampling, and you calculate a certain sample size that should be always larger or equal to 30. Then when you reach the second stage, let's say the expenditure items within the operation, you do exactly the same thing. What do I mean by the same thing? Within the operation, you apply the formulas of sample size calculation that are in line with the sampling method that you are using, and you have to feed in these formulas values for the parameters that are relevant, and these values, now I have to be very clear on this, and these values have to be compatible with ones used in the at the first stage. What does it mean, compatible? Compatible means that they don't need to be exactly the same, but they have to make sense. Example, if you expect an error rate globally, if you say that your anticipated error rate is 1.5%, it's not possible that within each operation you always say that your expected error rate is 0. It's not possible that it's always 0 and then globally it's 1.5. That is not possible. It's not compatible. But compatible also does not mean that for each operation you have to input 1.5. Of course not. The operations are different. You all know that there are some types of operations that have much less risk than the others. So it's perfectly possible that for some operations you say that you expect 0 error or an error below 1%, and for other operations you expect an error above 1.5%. Perfectly okay. But what should not happen is that they are all smaller or they are all larger than the global error that you expect for the population. That would not be compatible, as I said. Again, if you are using statistical sampling, for the subsample, the sample size again should always be equal or larger than 30. So, in short, and repeating what I have just said, compatible means that the parameters for both stages don't have to be exactly equal, but they have to be aligned with each other. They have to be plausible in this relationship. And when you think about the parameters that are required to calculate the sample size in any sampling method, either in MUS or simple random sampling, these 6 parameters stand out. Let's say either simple random sampling or MUS use some of these parameters. Z, which you know it's a parameter from the normal distribution associated with the confidence level. Tolerable error, which is in our case 2% of the declared expenditure. The book value, the population size, the anticipated error, and the standard deviation of the errors or the error rates, depending if you are using simple random sampling or MUS. And now what I would like to stress here is the following. Among these 6, I would like very much to separate them into 3 groups. First group are the parameters that in principle should be exactly equal in both stages of sampling. Which are they? Z and tolerable error. If you are working with a category 2 system and you are using a confidence level of 70%, then you have a certain value for Z, and this Z should be used both for the main sample and for the subsample. The same thing for the tolerable error in percentage. It's calculated based on materiality, which is 2%. So the tolerable error is 2% of the expenditure of the population in one case, or 2% of the expenditure of the operation in the other case. So these 2 are exactly. Then there are other 2 that I would say that are completely customized to the operation. Which are the book value, of course. In the main sample, this is the book value of the population. For the subsample, this is the book value of this particular operation. Capital N, population size, the same thing. For the main sample, this represents how many operations I have in the population. For the subsample, it represents how many expenditure items, for example, invoices, do I have within this operation. And then I have a third group of parameters that I would consider they are not necessarily exactly equal, but maybe they are not also completely different. These are the parameters that have to be adapted to the specificity of each operation. And what are they? The two most uncertain parameters, the anticipated error and the standard deviation of the errors and error rates. As you know, these two parameters usually are based on pilot samples or historical data, and these two parameters should be aligned between the first stage and second stage of sampling, but they do not have to be exactly equal. Again, coming back to my example, it's perfectly possible that in the first stage of sampling, I expect an error rate of 1.5%, but when I go to the second stage of sampling, I have some operations for which I expect 0%, and other operations for which I expect 2.5%, and other values. Does not matter, depends on your knowledge about these operations. But of course, globally speaking, the several values that of error that you anticipate within the operations may have to have some connection with the global figure of 1.5 that you have set for the for the whole population. This is the calculation of the sample size within subsampling, and the need to be realistic and adaptive in the choice of the values of the parameters. Then we have the topic of projection. For the projection, nothing to say. The projection is performed, as I said, as usual. You use the formulas of the projection going from the subsample into the operation and then the operation to the main sample. There's absolutely nothing new here. And in terms of precision, also it continues to be true that we are happy that you calculate precision as usual. I mean, if this work is correctly done, if you calculate the sample size in both stages with adequate formulas, we have the guarantee that the sample sizes of the second stage are enough to have a negligible effect over the global precision. And because of that, the good news is that you can calculate precision as usual. In other words, as if you are not using subsampling. You just disregard the subsampling and you calculate the precision as usual. And the errors of the operations will be filled in the precision formulas despite their nature. What do I mean by this? Sometimes they may be the true errors resulting from fully auditing the operation. In other cases, there are mere estimates that result from a subsample of expenditure items that you have audited within the operation, but you disregard that and you treat them as if they were the true errors of these operations. Just a note that I forgot to mention, but it's important to state. The methodology that we have prepared to you regarding selecting the subsamples into these two stages is a simplified methodology that is available, but you can use other methodologies, of course. And this means that you may be aware that there are more adequate ways and more complex ways to calculate the sample size within each stage. In fact, there are some methodologies that we could use to simultaneously calculate the sample size of the main sample and the sample size of the second of the subsample. If you are able to manage these more complex methodologies, this can save you some sample size. In practice, you may use smaller sample sizes than the ones that are offered in this methodology using these two stages as independent steps. So it's available if you like to use it, but the methodology that we have written in a very simplified version is this one where you can separate your work into 2 independent steps. Now, finally, other topics still in relation of the general sampling methods for the post-2020. Another relevant thing is the sampling unit. Here, nothing much new. The sampling unit may continue to be the operation, the project within the operation, or the payment claim, and the population is divided into these units for the purpose of sampling. Regarding the grouping of programs, which is something also very popular in the current ending programming period. It's still possible, the grouping. The sample may cover one, for the new programming period, may cover 1 or more programs receiving support from ERDF, ESF Plus, Cohesion Fund, and GTF, and of course, subject to stratification when considered appropriate. They can also cover 1 or more programming periods according to your professional judgment. Very importantly, there is presently no requirement of a common system to group programs. It's up to you, it's your decision. You know the pros and cons about grouping. Needless to say, if you group programs, there is a big advantage, which is, of course, you can save a lot of sample size, because instead of having 1 sample for each program, you just have 1 single sample covering several programs. The disadvantage is that you are no longer able to have audit opinions per program. You just have 1 single audit opinion for the group of programs. And here the risk, as always, is that 1 or 2 programs in the group are contaminating all the others, and that globally you may consider that you have a material error, when in fact this material error is only present in 1 or 2 programs within the group. But if you group them, you are not able to do this connection to prove this distinction, and your opinion will affect the whole expenditure of the population. Again, the sampling support of operations that are supported by EMFAF, AMIF, ESF, and BMVI have to cover the operations supported by each fund separately, okay? They are not in this list of funds for which the grouping is possible. Still in this line of the overview of the sampling methods in the pre and post 2020, and in particular with a focus on the Delegated Act. The Delegated Act is applied to the 8 funds concerned implemented under shared management, does not apply to Interreg programs that will, as many of you know, participate in the EU common sample that will be in the future selected directly by DAC. And this is it. Before we move on to more specific topics, this is, let's say, the first global overview about the sampling methodologies. So a reminder about the sampling methodologies that were available in the current programming period, and a focus on the changes foreseen for the new programming period. Now it's time to do a stop here and to give you time to ask any questions that you would like. I see that you already have some questions in the chat tool. Let me try to address some of them. But again, now you can raise your hand, open your microphone. So let me first address the hands raised and then the chat, okay? Sorry if I mispronounce any name. Iri Bezina?
Yeah. Oh, okay, do you hear me, Professor?
Yes, very well.
I cannot start the video, so you cannot see me, but I have in the chat a question concerning one case which we had on some sampling. And just to describe it, so we had okay, I will.
We see you now. Now, Iri, now you see, we see you, but we don't hear you. Yes? Try it again. Okay, I think the colleague is trying to reconnect. While he is trying to reconnect, let me address one question in the chat, last one. I don't know the name, but G. Salis. Instead to adapt parameters of the second stage, is it possible to make a pilot sample? Thank you for that. It's a very good question. Of course it is, and more importantly, they are not different things. They are not alternatives. When I say that we have to adapt parameters in the second stage, follow me, ladies and gentlemen, I have said, please try to adapt the anticipated error and the standard deviation. Adapt to the nature of this particular operation. But how can we do this adaptation? Well, this adaptation has to be inspired by some data. And very often it is inspired by what you see in the historical data. For example, you have seen for several years in a row that the type of operations that are like this one, probably this type of beneficiary or something, usually have very low risk. And you know historically that you can use a small anticipated error. But it is also possible and very much welcomed that you do these adaptations through the use of a pilot sample, of course. And moreover, look, because for the second stage, the minimum sample size is still 30, there's nothing to lose in taking a pilot sample of 30. In many cases, it's done, the work is finished, and the pilot sample of 30 will tell you that it's enough and you don't need to do any further work. If you still need to audit some additional invoices or expenditure items, well, at least 30 are already audited, and you can now just audit some more. Why the pilot sample is very important here in the context of subsample? Firstly, because without a pilot sample, sometimes it's difficult for you to have an opinion, let's say a customized opinion about parameters applied to each operation. And secondly, because the pilot sample can be a very good source to do what I have said here, which is, for instance, to implement stratification. We all know that sometimes a stratification at the second stage is extremely efficient. This case that I told you, separating the expenditure between salaries and other categories, for example. But to be sure that in fact these two categories of expenditure have completely different risks, it's a good practice to have a pilot sample, and then you can use this pilot sample to fine-tune the sample size that you allocate to each one of the stratum. Now, let's try to come back to Iri Pezina. Yes, we hear you.
You hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
It's fine. So I will try to briefly describe the situation. So we had general sample for one of our programs. The sample size was 40. But then we have audits of operation. And for one operation, which we consider very risky, we changed the parameter for the subsampling. So instead of 3%, we raised the anticipated error rate to 4%, which generate the sample of 30 instead of 40. At the end of the day, the error rate of this operation was about 6%. So there was no meaning, or it was irrelevant, because we haven't lost the precision. And we also audited in financial terms more percentage. The coverage was bigger than the general sample. So my question was, if we by increasing the parameter of anticipated error rate, but reducing the sample size from the general from 40 to 30, if we are still compatible or not. This is my question, because
very well.
Yeah,
Fully understood. Fully understood. Very good question. In fact, yes, I believe you are still compatible. What happens within this operation is that you consider this operation that it has more risk than the others, and by having more risk, you have increased the anticipated error. And then it happens something that it's a little bit against our intuition, which is to say, but I consider this one more risky, and the consequence is that I reduce the sample size instead of increasing the sample size. Yes, that's it. And why? Because you already expect it to be above materiality. And when you expect to be above materiality, the more the risk of the operation, the smaller the sample size needs to be. Because, follow me, ladies and gentlemen, if you have an operation with an error rate of 20%, it's very easy to conclude that the population, in fact, contains material error. So there's no doubt that makes sense. And if by the end of the day, if I understood well, the error rate of this operation was even bigger than the 4% that you have used for sample size calculation, even better, means it makes all sense and the results should be used like that.
Yes, exactly. It was 6 or 10%. I cannot remember exactly the figure. And this is concerning this changing the parameters for riskier operation on subsampling. And there was one slide at the end of this session where was the question regarding the ETC programs. And my questions on ETC programs is related to Article 148, which says that there is a certain threshold of 300,000 euros for operations, and such operations should not be audited twice in the programming period. I'm not sure now whether this is also applicable for the new program period, but I guess it is. Mm-hmm. So my question is whether there is some, because the sample will be selected by the European Commission for ETC programs, and I'm not sure whether there is a reporting requirement for audit authorities to somehow also submit a list of operations which were audited in the past and which does not meet the value of this operation is not more than 300,000 euros. This is just question for the arrangements of this sample at the multinational level.
I understand your question. This is more a management issue than a technical issue.
Okay.
I may, but let's try to address it. I'm going to ask for the help of Ms. Barbara Koschak from Dr. Disconnect. So the idea, Barbara, the idea is the following. Although this is going to be part of DTC common sample that is going to be managed by DAC, if the audit authorities should report operations that are under these restrictions of single audit arrangements, in order to avoid that we select these for the common sample.
I have some good news in this regard, because single audit arrangements that not refer to the operations under the common sample. Thus, there is no specific requirement to monitor and report to us.
Okay, so then it's easy. Okay, so there will be no reporting.
You don't need to look at it. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome. So let me check some more questions. Can we use historical data from the old funding period if there are only minor changes? I would say yes. Let's say the way you inspire yourselves to set the parameters that are necessary for sample size calculation is a matter of professional judgment. You can use historical data pilot samples as other auxiliary information. There are no restrictions in this regard. So if under your professional judgment you consider that this historical data may still be representative and may be a good source for setting these parameters, you are free to do so. There is no rule that will demand you to use a pilot sample or other methodology. Is it possible to group programs that are not in the same category? Yes, it's possible to group. It's possible to group any programs based on these funds that I have listed, and there is even no requirement of having a common system. Is it right that we can give an audit opinion per program in case of grouping programs? No, you cannot. If you group programs, you are assuming that you have one single audit opinion. If you like to have one opinion per program, you have to treat them as separate populations. Material errors in one program can affect the rest of group programs. Yes, of course. That's what I have just said a few minutes ago. Some of you have seen cases in your life where you have grouped 10 programs and there are only 1 or 2 of them with material error, but because you have grouped, now you are concluding that there is a material error affecting the whole group of 10 programs. This is the risk of grouping. If one program contains material errors, does only that program not fulfill the conditions? So again, if this is a group, the conclusion is not for the program, but is for the group. Can we take the program with material errors out of the group and continue apply? Yes, it's possible, but this means very often or almost always doing an significant additional work. I mean, follow me, ladies and gentlemen. If you have grouped 10 programs and there is one of them with material errors, and let's imagine that nobody is using these days sample sizes with hundreds of operations. Very often your sample size is 40, 50, 60, 70 operations, not more than that. It means that the number of operations that you have in your sample covering each program individually is relatively small. Usually, or almost always, much less than 30. What does it mean? It means that it's impossible for you to have an opinion per program. But imagine that after doing the audit, you have this group of 10 programs, and you are really convinced, although your sample is not representative per program, you are really convinced that there is one program that is contaminating everything, and you like to separate this program from all the others and to have 2 audit opinions. Is it possible? Yes. But usually this means, or almost always this means, to select an additional sample for the program that you need to autonomize. And the additional sample is very simple. At minimum, it has to be 30, the total sample. So if you have already only audited 5 or 10 operations from this program, in the very minimum, you have to audit 20 more to have 30. And in some cases, even more than that, because you have to apply the formula and you have to cover the sample size that the formula gives you. So imagine you have audited 10 and now you need 40. This means that you need to audit 30 more. Yes, Barbara. Barbara?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I would like to add some legal clarifications concerning grouping of programs which are subject to Article 83 and 84, proportionate enhanced arrangements. In such case, to apply the sample of 30, all of this program needs to be subject to these same arrangements. If you mix different programs, then you can apply 50, provided that all of them are subject to category 1 and 2. And now, in case we are, as Professor clarified, in case we are grouping the programs, statistically, the conclusiveness of the results are for group of programs, not per individual program, but still based on our legal framework, when we give opinion on programs, they are based on different kind of audits, audits of operations, system audits, and audits of accounts. Thus, in reality, even if you group the programs, then finally you use this combination of different kinds of information to give an opinion to us on program.
Yes, but again, to have an opinion per program, you have to have a minimum sample size of 30 in that program if it is statistical, and in some cases even more if the formula tells you that you have to increase the sample size. But it's perfectly possible that after the audit, you decide to disconnect a program from a group and you have to audit opinions, okay? Only thing is that this usually involves doing some additional work. If the management and control system of the program that had material errors is again in control, can it be returned to the group, this to rest of programs for applying EPA? I'm not sure if I understand. Barbara, can you follow this question? So I mean, if you have disconnected a program from a group that had material errors, but after some time you consider that this program is now managed by a better control system and you believe that you would like to group it again to the rest of the group, if I understand well, this is the question. Okay, you say, then this means that you can group it again in the future, of course. Greek Audit Authority's capping of 50 applicable. Let's talk about that in a while. Okay, I will go to the grouping in a few minutes. Is it possible to group instead of the parameters of second stage file simply have addressed? If the modified anticipated error, it's what you have already said, Iri Pezina, we have answered this. Is there a template developed by the European Commission to calculate sample size and for extrapolation as is in 1420? Well, I would say that the templates that we have for the 1420 are completely applicable to this new programming period, because in what you have seen, there is no change in the sample size calculation besides the possibility for the capping that we are going to talk about in a few minutes. But the process itself of calculating sample size is exactly the same. We have not changed the sampling methods, we have not changed the formulas. So I would say that there is no need to adapt the templates, and you can still freely use them. Guidelines, yes, you can refer to the guidelines. Upload. Okay. Can you, I think we have addressed all the questions. Please let me know if not. So another small topic, but important, exactly this topic that we are right now talking about, simplified sampling methodology. So in this context of statistical sampling, we all know that the sample size is currently calculated with a formula. The formula depends on the sampling methodology, of course. The formula for MUS is different from the formula for simple random sampling, or the formula for stratified MUS, or the formula for multi-period simple random sampling. We have different formulas. But all the formulas that we have to calculate sample size have in common that they depend on several parameters. And very often the parameters that you need to calculate sample size are population size, book value, anticipated error, and the standard deviation of the errors or the error rates, maybe among others like the parameter Z and others. And this methodology that we have now is designed in such a way that the sample size that you achieve by applying these formulas should be sufficient for you to have conclusive results and allow you to issue an audit opinion with reasonable assurance. Okay, this is the goal of having a formula. The goal is to control the global audit risk. For example, this is a mere example just to remind you. In standard MUS, we calculate the sample size in this way. Sample size is given by Z from the normal distribution, book value, standard deviation of the error rates. And here we have the tolerable error, which is 2% of the expenditure. And this is the anticipated error. and to this difference we call the planned precision. Many of you remember this, at least the ones that have followed the seminar yesterday remember this very well for sure. This is the standard methodology. Also, in the current programming period, we have specific methodologies for multi-period approaches. Why? Because if you calculate a sample size in the context of a multi-period approach in period 1, you have to make assumptions about parameters of the future periods. We don't even know how much expenditure will be declared in the next period of the year and how much will be the parameters. And because of that, under multi-period approaches, we also have other formulas that allow you to update the sample sizes for the forthcoming periods when new information is available. For instance, when you reach the second period, this is a mere example. When you reach the second period under MUS, you have a formula that, based on knowing now the true declared expenditure of period 2 and some additional updated information of period 2, and also, if possible, results from the sample of period 1, you can update the sample size of period 2, again, having in mind to achieve a sample size that will allow you to have conclusive results. By the way, this formula here is under multi-period approach, is in the context of our standard multi-period methodology, but in the guidance note, we also have another methodology that we have called the global recalculation of the sample size, that in some cases is necessary or even advisable, but it's completely out of the scope of this presentation today, just to remind you this. And then what do we do in the context of statistical sampling? Well, why do we care to calculate sample sizes properly? We care to calculate sample sizes properly in order to control the audit risk. And when you issue an unqualified opinion, you know that if all the process has been designed correctly, that the risk that you are wrong, the risk that you issue an unqualified opinion when in fact your declaration of expenditure contains material errors, is not larger than 5%. So it's the way auditors have to control the issuing a wrong opinion. And the key element to do this is to compare the results of your audits, as you know, with the materiality threshold. So when you have results of your audits, two things may happen, as many of you have seen this yesterday. First of all, the two elements that are necessary to achieve a conclusion are the projected error and, as all of you know, the upper error limit. And the rule that we use is the following: if the projected error is larger than materiality threshold, we automatically conclude that the population contains material error. If both the projected error and the upper error limit are below the materiality threshold, we conclude that the population does not contain material error. If the projected error is below the materiality threshold, but the upper error limit is above the materiality threshold, this is this undesirable situation of having inconclusive results. And based on these results, you cannot state if we are below or above materiality. This is the current situation and how we use this information as a base for our audit opinion. So I would just like to remind you about the whole process in the current programming period. For the future, the process is basically the same, but now we have this possibility of limiting the sample sizes. So the formulas and the rules that I have presented you in these previous 3 or 4 slides are exactly the same, okay? Rules and formulas still apply. The only difference is now we have an optional, it's very important to stress it's optional element, which is the possibility to cap the sample size to 50 units in case of category 1 or 2 systems. If the system is category 3 or 4, you don't have this possibility, and you have to use the traditional, let me call it traditional, the current methodology. So what happens for the post-2020? If you have a category 1 or 2 system, you can apply still the formula, for instance, for sample size calculation. Imagine that the formula for a particular situation gives you a sample size of 60. I'm going to get a situation where the sample size is above this capping of 50, and you may decide to cap your sample size to 50 units, even if that formula, statistical formula, gives you a larger sample size. Okay, so this is a possibility, but it's optional. Of course, it's not mandatory. It's up to you to decide if you want to use this possibility or not. You are very much welcome to continue to use the sample size that is offered by the form. The capping of this sample size can be applied by you based on professional judgment. It's very important to state, this is regardless whether the operation concerns just one or more OPs. So if you have a group of operational programs, the capping still applies to this group. As you understand, this is a simplification tool that the Commission decided to make available for programs that are managed under higher quality control systems, so systems under category 1 and 2. Now, there is here a sentence about enhanced proportionate arrangements, but let me stress the situation about enhanced proportionate arrangements first. So, what is the other possibility of, let's say, capping? The other possibility of capping is what has been set in the CPR and referenced as enhanced proportionate arrangements, and I'm just underlying here under article 83 and 84 what I consider to be the most relevant passages for this explanation now, which is said that the audit authority may limit the audit activity of the audit of operations to a sample based on statistical selection of 30 sampling units for a program or a group of programs. So this is even a further capping of the sample size. You can cap your sample size instead of 50 to 30. Of course, if your population is below the new threshold for non-statistical sampling, you still may apply the non-statistical sampling method. And what are the conditions to apply this stronger capping, where the conditions are situations where the Commission have confirmed in the published reports that for the last 2 years preceding the decision, first of all, the management and control system is functioning effectively, and that the total error rate for 2 years in a row has been below 2%. And if you want to use this possibility of enhanced proportionate arrangements of, let's say, stronger capping, you have to notify the Commission on this, and in such a case, the arrangements will apply from the start of the subsequent accounting year. So, capping of 50 for any category 1 or 2 system, and of 30 if on top of that you fulfill these conditions, and the most relevant additional condition is to have error rate below 2% for into sequential years. And just another piece of information. At the start of a programming period, it is still possible to apply this condition if these conditions that we have talked about are met in respect to a program implemented in the previous programming period that has been considered to be similar, and where the management and control arrangements that you have established for the new programming period are largely the same or based on the ones of the previous program. Now, in practical terms, what does this mean? That you have basically three alternatives. Okay, there is a first one which is the 30, but it's the same thing. One, for a population that is under a category 1 or 2 system, you can automatically decide to use a sample size of 50. In that case, you don't even need to calculate the sample size. You automatically decide to use 50. Second option, you can freely enlarge the sample size to a larger value. You can decide that you want to audit 55 or 60 or 70. Also, there is no need to use any formula. Third option, if you'd like to use a sample size smaller than 50 under a statistical approach, you can, but in this case, you have to do what you have done during the previous programming period, which is based on realistic parameters, apply a certain formula and see if the formula gives you a sample size smaller than 50. If you prove that based on reasonable assumptions, you apply this formula and it gives you 40, of course, you are allowed, as in the past, to use a sample size smaller than 50. So for fourth option, you can further reduce it to 30 units under the conditions of enhanced proportional arrangements that we have just foreseen. So just a little bit more detail about options 1, 2, and 3. Option 1, automatically use a capped sample size of 50 or 30 if you are under the conditions of the CPR. First of all, although you have automatically used this sample size and there is no need to calculate a sample size based on a statistical formula, you still need to project the errors of the sample to the population, of course, but also you still need to calculate precision and the upper error limit, okay? Precision and upper error limit have to be calculated like in statistical sampling, but you have the guarantee that no additional work will be required, whatever are the results, okay? So even if your upper error limit is above 2%, you can still keep your results, but it's important for the Commission to keep track of how are the precisions developing during the programming period. Your audit opinion, in what regards of course, the substantive testing, is solely based on comparing the projected error with the materiality threshold, okay? You don't need to compare also the upper error limit with the materiality threshold, like in the general methodology that I have presented here in this slide. You just need to compare the projected error with materiality threshold like you would do in the context of non-statistical sample. So this is option 1. Option 2, you can freely enlarge your sample size to a value larger than 50, whatever you would like the value. This enlargement can be based either on a formula or professional judgment. For example, you have applied this formula and gives you 60. You may decide, although I could cap my sample size to 50, to be on the safe side, I prefer to use 60. So you are completely welcome to use the 60. But if instead of using a formula, these 60 are just set by your professional judgment, also no problem. You don't need to justify why do you want to reach 60, okay? So professional judgment is fine in order to increase the sample size. Again, as in the previous example, you need to project the errors to the population and you need to calculate the upper error limit. But again, your audit opinion will be solely based on comparing the projected error with the materiality threshold. And again, as in the previous example, no additional work or analysis is needed regardless the value of the upper error limit. Third option, you would like to use a sample size smaller than 50. Yes, you can use a sample size smaller than 50 under statistical approach. In this case, you have to calculate the sample size as usual with a formula. And then after calculating the sample size and auditing the sample, you need to project the errors and to calculate the upper error limit as usual. But now there is a difference, of course, which is the result. If you want to be below the capping, your results have to be evaluated both on the basis of the projected error and the upper error limit. Okay, so to conclude that the population does not contain material error, you must have both the projected error and the upper error limit below materiality, as in the general methodology that you are applying in the in the current or the ending programming period. Okay, this is just for the case you would like to use a smaller sample size than the 50. Importantly to say, the capping, either 50 or 30, can be applied in the context of stratification and in the context of multivariate sampling. The value of 50 or 30 refers still to the whole population. I mean, to the whole population containing several stratum and or the whole population containing several periods. If you have your population stratified or in a multivariate approach, you still use the same rule as before. What was the rule? The rule that we used in the past, that the minimum sample size per stratum, the very minimum is 3, and ideally the definition would like you to have not less than 5, but let's say the very minimum 3 per stratum. And again, this is applicable in each stratum and in each period. You should apply this minimum of 3. Some additional notes. If you use the capped sample size of 50, these 50 can be applied to the sample that may contain several programs and several programming periods. The fixed sample size of 30 refers to a program or a group of programs covered by the proportional control arrangements, and this has to be in line with the Article 83 and 84. A special note of attention: in some sampling designs, you may have an exhaustive stratum. If an exhaustive stratum exists, only high-value units may count for the achievement of the capped sample size. What do I mean by this? Well, it may happen that you have designed one or more exhaustive stratum, and some of the units of this exhaustive stratum are not necessarily high-value units, are units that you decided that you'd like to include in your audit for sure, because they represent what you consider a risky area. You would like to cover these units. It's very perfectly acceptable and recommendable that you do that. But if you have different units in the exhaustive stratum, only the high-value ones will count for achieving the 50. In the context of multivariate sampling, and in case of underestimating the forecast of the population size or the population expenditure for the following periods, it may happen that you have to adapt your capped sample size. Based on the information that will arise in the future regarding the population size or population expenditure, it may happen that you still need to increase to some extent your sample size to compensate for the underestimated values of the forecasts, or as an alternative, if you prefer, you can calculate the sample size for these new periods using the multivariate formulas, as we have shown you here, as I have shown you here, with this kind of formula that I have just illustrated for MUS, and you can apply this for the new period. You can use the methodology that you consider more adequate or more favorable to your conditions. And to illustrate this, let me give you an example, because this is probably the most, let's say, confusing situation, which is how to cap in the context of a multi-period approach. So imagine that we have a capped sample size of 50. And expenditure in period 1 of the year was 120 million, and the audit authority has predicted for the second period of the year expenditure of 80 million. So the audit authority decided to use the capped sample size of 50, and you have to allocate the sample size between the two periods. How do you do that? Well, based on your expectations, on your forecasts in terms of declared expenditure. So period 1 is generating 120 million out of 200 million. And if you multiply this ratio by 50, you get a sample size of 30. And for the second period, you get the remaining sample size, which is 20 to achieve the cap sample size of 50. So it's done. In period 1, you are absolutely sure that you are going to audit 30 units. But what happens when you reach period 2? Imagine that when you reach period 2, the expenditure of period 2 is very different from what you expect. Instead of 80 million, is 140 million. We have to acknowledge that we have seriously under-predicted the expenditure of the second period. So in that case, you should adjust the sample size of the second period. How? You have to do the ratio again. I mean, how much the expenditure of the second period represents in terms of the total expenditure of the year? Well, 140 over 260. If we multiply this by the 50, you get 27. This means that instead of auditing 20 operations in the second period, based on the new known declared expenditure, you should audit 27. By the end of the day, this means that your cap sample size in practice has to be enlarged from 50 to 57, which is the 30 that you have audited in the first period. We are not going to throw units away. They are audited and it's closed. And now you have to audit 27 additional units, okay? Now, if you consider that it's more favorable for you, instead of just doing this adaptation of the 27, you can go again into the formulas of statistical sampling, and you can recalculate the sample size for period 2. And it may happen, depending on your data, that the sample size for period 2, based on information now you have available, it's 15. And if it is 15, in fact, it means that you can do your work with a sample size of 30 plus 15, which is 45 in total, instead of the 57, which is perfectly fine, because we have always said that any moment you may decide to, instead of using the capped sample size, to use the results of the statistical formulas applied to your population. This is particularly true in a multi-period approach, where if you have 2 or 3 periods, you still have time to regret your decision, and instead of using the capped sample size, apply the formulas if you consider that it's more adequate or gives you a sample size that is more in line with what makes sense for this population. If you are in the context of simple random sampling, the idea is exactly the same, but the only difference is that instead of working with book values, we work with population sizes. So period 1, 1,200 operations, and period 2 prediction, 1,400 operations. Again, capped sample size of 50, which means that we foresee for period 1, we are going to audit a sample of 23, 1,200 over 2,600 times 50, and we reserve 27 for the second period. We reach the second period, and in fact, we have 1,800 operations. Well, no problem, we have to adapt. Now we have to acknowledge that the new population size in period 2 over the total population size has increased. If I multiply this by 50, I mean the proportion allocated to the second period has to be increased from 27 to 30, and by the end of the day, we would have to do the work with, instead of 50, 53, 23 that are already audited for period 1, and 30 that you are going to audit for period 2. If you consider more adequate, you can still go back to the statistical formulas and calculate the sample size for the second period with this formula, and whatever is the result that this gives you, either larger or smaller than 30, it's up to you to use this approach instead of using this approach of the capped sample size. Okay, it's your decision to use or not the statistical formulas. Okay, and I believe this is all about capping sample size, simplified sampling methodologies, and I will do now another stop to have time for questions related to these topics. Please raise your hands, open your microphones, and while you do that, I will also look into the chat tool. Marcin Karpinski, first straight 49, second straight 3. How many items do I choose, 50 or 52? I'm not sure if I understand your question. Would this be in the context of a multi-period approach? If this is because your population expenditure has changed and now you have to increase a little bit the sample size from 50 to 52, if yes, sure, you have to increase. But otherwise, if the sense of your question is something else, please write it again in the chat or just open your microphone. Shams Arya, is there a template to calculate the sample size precision and extrapolating, including upper and lower limit? Yes, there is. Well, not including lower limit, because in practical terms, we don't need the lower limit to achieve the conclusions, but you have templates for all the sampling methods using we have, and these templates, I believe, are available for the audit authorities. In case we choose to freely enlarge the sample size above 50 in the framework of a stratified sampling, the extra sample could be selected only of one stratum, or allocation to stratum is needed. No, not at all. If you use the capping of, if you guarantee that all your stratum are covered by the 50, whatever you decide to do on top of that does not need to be allocated proportionally to the stratum. Example, I have, let me open here a slide to explain this. It's a very good point. I have here a situation where I have two strata in a population. Okay, this one represents 40% of the population, and this one represents 60% of the population. You decide to use a cap sample size of 50, and you allocate proportionally to the expenditure, okay? And 1 equal to 20, and then 2 equal to 30. Now, imagine that you have decided that you would like to have 60 instead of 50. Perfect. It's up to you. If you'd like to have 60, you can still allocate this additional 10 proportionally to the expenditure based on some other formula or criterion, or you can just put this 10 in a specific stratum if you'd like. Imagine that you say, no, I believe that this first stratum has a specific risk and I would like to boost the sample size of stratum 1. So I would like to have 30 here plus 30 in the second stratum. No problem. You can fine-tune your sample size as you wish, provided that you guarantee that you have covered the minimum of 20 in stratum 1 and 30 in stratum 2. Miss Barbara Korczak, the templates for sample size calculation, projection, and so on are available for the audit authorities.
Yes, we can submit if somebody would like to get them and he doesn't or she doesn't have them, please contact us, we'll submit. And generally, as Professor clarified, they are useful for also the new programming period.
How do I meet the minimum size per stratum of 3? If we have an exhaustive stratum of one operation with, let's say, 20% of the overall costs, and a low value stratum with units between 0.1 and 2% of the overall cost, do I have to enlarge the high value stratum? Yes, I understand your question. Not at all. When we say that each stratum should have at least 3 items, we mean stratum that are covered by a statistical sampling. If you have an exhaustive stratum, you are just observing how many items you have there. You can perfectly design an exhaustive stratum with just 1 item or just 2 items. There is no problem in that, okay? So only in case a sample is selected, you need to guarantee that 3 items are covered in that stratum. What happens if the planned amount in the second period is less than we predicted? Do you need to adjust the sample size for the first period? Yes, the question makes the whole sense, but I believe, again, I will use the help of Ms. Barbara Koschak. As far as I know, the Commission has not decided that this would be necessary. Yes, we decided this. If the expenditure is reducing, the audit authorities do not need to revisit the first period of sampling.
Indeed, I think that in our legislation, it is only clarified. I don't know whether I understood the question, but our legislation refers only to underestimated values of the population in the second or the following periods.
Exactly. But it may make sense, and if you like to do that voluntarily, of course, that in some cases would make sense to increase the sample size of the already audited periods. But we don't, in principle, the legislation does not demand that. At which email address can we ask for the Excel templates? Ms. Barbara Koschak.
Yes, so our functional mailbox from which you received invitation for this seminar, ECDAC Audit Coordination.
Exactly. How to calculate the upper error limit and the projected error when we have the capping to 50? Is there a template for that as well? Hans Wahelmai. Yes, sure. You can calculate using exactly the same template. Follow me. If in these templates for sample size calculation and projection, you have a cell where maybe I can even share one example of a template with you, so you understand how you can adapt the already existing templates. Just give me a second. So imagine the following. Okay, let me share this screen with you. So imagine a template. I will pick any template. Imagine a template that you have here. This one is for standard MUS, okay? As many of you know, in these templates, you have these white and blue cells. The white cells are the ones that you have to fill in with parameters and so on, and the blue ones are the ones that are calculated. Now, imagine that you fill in here any information at all, just for the sake of explaining. Example here. Look, I have just randomly inserted some data here for you to see. So imagine that in this case, this template gave you a sample size of 57, okay? But this is a category 1 system and you decided to cap to 50. When you fill in here then the results of the audit, let me put here some results. Let me see if I can put something that that makes sense. Okay, let's put like this. Okay, imagine whatever these are the results. Imagine that these results that you have here, instead of being achieved with sorry, let's put something like this, with a sample size of 57, they were really achieved with a sample size, a capped sample size of 50. The only thing that you need to do in this template is that manually you have to tell Excel that you have not used the 57 that were given by the formulas, but that you have used 50. You can do this. You can do this manually, insert 50 here. And if this is the true sample size that you have used, then you feed in here the results as usual, and this will give you the results. It will tell you that the projected error rate is 0.6%, the upper error limit is 1.77%, and work is done. So really there is no need for additional templates. The only thing is that you have to consider that because you have manually decided to cap your sample size, this has to be included here. And if you are using a stratification, when you go to the stratified MUS template, in the place of the sample size, you have here some formulas that will give you the sample size per stratum. And again, if this has been kept in the sample size per stratum, has been manually decided, not based on the formula, but based on these capping principles, you just have to manually insert here the exact sample sizes that you have really audited in each stratum. And again, this will automatically and correctly calculate the projected errors and the upper error limit and help you to achieve your conclusions. Let me share again this PowerPoint. And let me continue to look at your questions. Maybe the Excel template can be put here so everybody. Well, I think you have to ask it for the to the commission email. It has to be has to follow the proper channels. Let me see if before this we have any question that I have not answered. We have choose to fill in large, one stratum. minimum rule of 3 units shall be respected, but you can try to round up or round down the size of the first and second straight. Okay, this was an answer. Regarding sample size and certification, using most standard approach, the calculated sample size is 30. The sample size is allocated to study proportionally to the book value. To respect minimum of 3 units per stratum, within second study must be selected 3 units. This means that the total number is increased from 30 to 31. Well, yes, it could in an extreme case to happen the need to increase 1 unit in the sample size, but let's say in practical terms, through the rounding, usually this wouldn't happen. You can, this is a very important thing. Sample sizes always have to be rounded up, global sample sizes, but the sample sizes per stratum do not need to be rounded up. They can be rounded to the nearest integer, which means that sometimes they are rounded up, sometimes they are rounded down, and usually they compensate one another. Okay, I think we have addressed all questions. Any additional questions regarding this simplified sampling methodology? If not, it's more than time to do our break. So let's resume at let's say 11:45, okay? 11:45. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Let's continue our visit to these current and future sampling methods. So we have seen an overview about the available sampling methodologies, both in the current and forthcoming programming period. We have seen particularities of simplified methodology. And now I would like to give you a focus on non-statistical sampling. Again, very much focus on the current methodologies and the changes that are foreseen for the post-2020. So, of course, that you remember that for the current programming period, the non-statistical sampling is basically reserved for small populations. As a rule, we should always apply statistical sampling. You all know why, because when we apply non-statistical sampling, we do not control the audit risk. And when you issue an audit opinion, you don't have any quantitative support to know how likely it is that you are right or wrong in your opinion. So as a rule, we prefer to use statistical sampling, but we can also use for small populations non-statistical sampling. The idea of a threshold for the use of non-statistical sampling is just based on the consideration that sometimes a certain population is relatively small, and of course this means that the effort to perform statistical sampling could be disproportionate in regard to this to the relatively small importance of the population. For the 14-20 programming period, the threshold for the application of non-statistical sampling has been set to a range, not a value, but to a range. As you are going to see, this is going to change in the future, but for the current one, you already know the range is between 50 and 150 population units, which means that in general, above 150, you should use statistical sampling. In general, below 50, you should use non-statistical. In the between, it's very much a case-by-case analysis. What else have we said in the current programming period in relation to non-statistical sampling? That even if you are using non-statistical sampling, we all know that the sample itself has to be selected using probabilistic methods. So the most well-known probabilistic methods to select such a sample are equal probability selection, mimicking what we do under simple random sampling, or probability proportional to expenditure selection, mimicking very much what we do under MUS. Also, we have stated that even under non-statistical sampling, although there is not a formula to calculate sample size, the sample size is set based on professional judgment. It's also set that the sample size should take into account the assurance provided by the management and control systems, and in general should, of course, in a more difficult way to quantify, but should be sufficient to enable to draw a valid audit opinion. Some other principles that are present and may continue to be present in the future for non-statistical samplings. Non-statistical sample, in the context of non-statistical samples, you are encouraged to consider the possibility to stratify the population. And why is this? You already know, in particular the ones that have been with us yesterday. Stratification is a very efficient tool to improve the quality of our projections. And because of that, if we know that the non-statistical sampling is a simplified approach when compared to statistical sampling that has some fragilities because we do not calculate the audit risk or the upper error limit, or we do not properly calculate the sample size, of course, that we should give to the non-statistical sample all the help that we can. And one of the helps that we can give is stratification as being a very efficient tool to improve the quality of the sample. Of course, needless to say that under non-statistical sampling, the stratification usually involves just a few stratum, very often just two stratum. Of course, if I have samples that whose size sometimes is 5 units, 10 units, there is no room to have lots of stratum because the sample size is just not enough. So in this case, of course, we use just 2 or 3 stratum very often. Which criteria you are recommended to use to stratify non-statistical samples? Well, all the criteria that are available for statistical samples are still available for non-statistical samples, but one of the things that is very popular, if your non-statistical sample is selected with equal probabilities, one thing that is very popular is to perform the stratification by level of expenditure. The stratification by level of expenditure is very popular because it may contribute to improve the quality of the sample, but it has a second feature that you all know. The stratification by level of expenditure can be used to increase the coverage of the sample in terms of expenditure. And because in the ending programming period, the thresholds of coverage for expenditure tend to be larger than the thresholds of coverage in terms of number of units, of course, that this strategy is one of those that you can use in order to guarantee that your thresholds for expenditure are covered. If you implement a stratification by expenditure, it's very important to stress something that I know that is very well known by some of you, but still may trigger some doubts. The stratification by expenditure is design-based, is designed by you. And this means that you do not need to put this threshold in a specific level like in MUS. In MUS, the threshold for the high-value items is equal to the book value divided by the sample size. Here in non-statistical sampling, you can put a threshold where you consider adequate based on your professional judgment. It does not need to be the book value divided by the sample size. I've seen other auditors that thought that the threshold should be, for some reason, equal to 2% of the expenditure. No, nothing like that. You should look into the population and to see if there is a frontier between which you can say, okay, this tends to separate higher value items from lower value items, and you tend to adjust this threshold to the characteristics of the population, very often increasing the threshold for smaller populations. And of course, as I said, it is also possible to use more than 2 expenditure-based stratum, 3 or more, but of course that under non-statistical sampling, we don't have so much room to use many stratum. Third idea is the following. If under non-statistical sampling you implement stratification by level of expenditure, you can still do an exhaustive audit of the high-value stratum, but this is not mandatory. In practice, there are many situations where you just don't have enough sample size to an exhaustive audit of the high-value stratum. So if your high-value stratum has 10 units and your global sample just have 6, there is no way you can fully audit the high-value stratum. No problem at all. Under non-statistical sampling, all the strata, including the high-value stratum, can be observed through sampling. So you can just take a sample from the high-value stratum items and a sample from the low-value stratum items. The only thing that we suggest you vividly is that, as a general rule, the sampling weight should be larger in the high-value stratum and smaller in the low-value stratum. Or in other words, you should, in general, select a larger percentage of the high-value items than the percentage of items that you choose from the low-value items. So imagine you are going to choose 50% of the high-value items and just 5% of the low-value items, something like that. Okay, this is the only rule that we suggest. Let me create an example here. If I have this population with 2 stratum, so if I have this population with 2 stratum, where I have 10 items here and 30 items here, and you want to take a sample of, I don't know, 6 items, you may decide to take 3 items from the upper stratum and 3 items from the lower stratum. What it means? It means that you are auditing 30% of the high-value items, but only 10% of the low-value items. Okay, this is the typical pattern that we see in this context of certification by expenditure within non-statistical sampling. Of course, that even under non-statistical sampling, it's perfectly acceptable that you do not stratify. If you cannot find a relevant stratification criterion that you consider that may be useful to explain the level of errors in the population and to improve the quality of the sample, in that case, you just don't stratify at all, and you select your non-statistical sample directly from the whole population. What are the sample sizes that are recommended? Again, let's see the ending programming period, and then let's see the forthcoming programming period. For the current programming period, and also for the next one, the sample size will be calculated using professional judgment, of course, taking into consideration the assurance provided by the systems audits. But for the specific 14-20 period, you all remember that the non-statistical sample should cover 5% of the operations and 10% of the expenditure. We always have said that these thresholds correspond to the best case scenario. What does it mean? Well, it means that if you don't have a category 1, but rather a category 2, 3, or 4 system, then these thresholds should be increased. And we have said the higher your assessment about the risk of material error, so the higher the risk of the control system, also the larger or the coverage of the sample size should be. So what does it mean? It means the following. The only mandatory rule is that in the ending programming period, we consider that you should cover 5% of the operations and 10% of the expenditure. And then as a general recommendation, we suggest that these thresholds are increased in line with the categorization of the system. So for category 2 systems, to cover between 5 to 10% of the items and 10% of the expenditure. For category 3, between 10 and 15% of the items and 10 to 20% of the expenditure. For category 4,
15 to 20% of items and 10 to 20% of expenditure. What else? Both for the ending and the new programming period, the sample, as I have just said a few minutes ago, have to be selected with probabilistic methodology. And this means that very typically the sample is selected either using equal probability selection, completely mimicking what we do in simple random sampling, or with the rules of probability proportional to expenditure selection, exactly using the selection algorithm that you use for MUS. So the selection itself is the same thing. The only difference is that the sample size is not calculated with a statistical formula, but it's rather an empirical professional judgment decision. And what about the projection of the errors? Well, for the projection of the errors, nothing new. Because you select the samples probabilistically, also the errors should be projecting using the formulas from simple random sampling or from MUS. So basically, and as a summary, and again in this seminar we are not going into technical details, but basically the idea is the following. If you are selecting your samples with equal probability and no stratification at all, well, the projection methods that you have available, you already know which they are: mean per unit estimation and ratio estimation. For the new programming period, as you know, the ratio estimation is a standard projection method that you can use without justification. If you would like to use mean per unit estimation, you should justify that is a better method. If you are using, if you are selecting units with probability proportional to the expenditure, then you project the errors using the MUS estimator. How is it? Many of you remember, it's the sum of the error rates multiplied by the sampling interval. If you are using stratified designs, you just need to use the stratified simple random sampling estimators or templates, or the stratified MUS estimator or template, and you can project the errors under simple random sampling or under non-statistical sampling with equal or unequal probabilities, exactly as if you were doing simple random sampling or MUS estimation. Finally, the evaluation of the errors. Well, these are what I can call, I don't know if I should call it the good or the bad news. In fact, they are not news at all, because you know this, but because this is non-statistical, there is no calculation of precision. There is also no room to calculate the error limit. There is no possibility to control the audit risk. So the only tool that we have available to support, to help our opinion, is to compare the projected error with materiality threshold, or the tolerable error, if you want to call it like that. And again, if the projected error is above the tolerable error, we tend to say that the population contains material error. If the projected error is below the tolerable error, we tend to say that the population does not contain material error. And of course, that you know that this does not control the audit risk, but as I said, is the best tool that we have in our power to do this evaluation. What about a specific incursion on the topic of subsampling in the context of non-statistical sampling? If in this context of non-statistical sampling, you are using subsampling, then first rule, the items of the subsample have also to be selected randomly, probabilistically. Again, although the subsample itself is non-statistical, the selection of the invoices or other expenditure items have to be done with random numbers. At the level of the subsample, it's still possible to apply a stratification, certifying the expenditure items per category of expenditure or by level of expenditure. And it is also possible, if adequate, based on your professional judgment, that some stratum are verified exhaustively and others are verified through a sample. Let's say that under non-statistical sampling is not so normal to have exhaustive stratum, because we just typically don't have enough sample size to do that. And other forms of certification, as I said, can be based on the type of expenditure, the amount of the invoices. All of this is available, like exactly in the same way we have for the statistical samples. If you are using subsampling with invoices, this is for the ending programming period. If you are using subsampling of invoices, we should not cover less than 30 invoices in the subsample. If we are using other items for subsample, you can, based on professional judgment, use any other sample size. But the recommendation is that you should cover at least 10% of the expenditure of that operation if you are doing subsampling within the operation. So either 30 or 10%. Just to illustrate what I have just said, let me use a very simple example. Imagine that we have a population of 48 operations. Clearly, this is the case where we would like to use non-statistical sampling. This will be a non-statistical sampling with stratification of the high-value operations, okay? We decided to introduce two stratum, one high-value, one low-value stratum. And the high-value operations are identified by setting a cutoff value of 5%. As I said, the cutoff value under this context of non-statistical sampling is free based on your analysis of the population. So this is it. In this population, we had 12 high-value items and 36 low-value items with these amounts of expenditure, 7.6 million in one case and 2.8 million in the other case. This is a category 3 system. Because this is a category 3 system, let me go back. We should cover at least 10 to 15% of items and 10 to 20% of expenditure. So let me aim for 15% of items and 20% of expenditure. How do you do this? Well, if I have 48 operations, 15% of 48 is 7.2. We always round up the sample sizes, so we end up with 8 operations to be covered in our sample. Now, we have two straight, as you remember, this stratum with 12 and this stratum with 36. And we decided to use a sample of 8. How to allocate? Sorry, it's under professional judgment. The only thing that we recommend is that you guarantee a higher coverage of the 12 when compared with the coverage of the 36. So let me imagine that this audit authority decided to, audit what? To audit 50% of the high value, 50% of the high value operations, which are 6 operations. So basically the decision would be to audit 6 here and 2 here, okay? Under non-statistical sampling, the rule of the minimum of 3 items per stratum is not mandatory. It's still recommendable, but not mandatory. But as it is recommendable, let's imagine that to avoid just have two operations here, we decided to increase to 3, which means that in practical terms, our sample size is not 8, but 9, okay? 6 high-value items and 3 low-value items. And for the both stratum, you are going to select the sample with equal probabilities. We consider that there is not enough variability in the expenditures to justify something else. A problem that we should already remind ourselves about
is the fact that although we are planning to audit 15% of the items, we would like to cover 20% of the expenditure. And the problem is it possible to guarantee that just by auditing 15% of the items, I can achieve 20% of coverage in terms of expenditure? Yes, of course. Why? Because I have used this technique, which is to have a more significant selection of the high value items. Because I'm selecting 50% of the high value items and less than 10% of the low value items, it is very likely that I will achieve the coverage of 20% in terms of expenditure. By the way, this is one of the two techniques that you have available to increase the coverage in terms of expenditure. One is to create this certification by value of the items. Another one, which is also very efficient, is to select the items with probability proportional to expenditure instead of selecting with equal probabilities. Of course, if you select with PPS, this means that your sample will be distorted in the direction of having a lot of representation of high value items and small representation of low value items, and this also will help you to have a higher coverage in terms of expenditure. So we expect to have this 20% of expenditure. So after drawing the samples, imagine that among the 6 high value operations that were audited, no errors were found. Among the 3 low value operations that were selected, errors were found in the amount of 4,000 something euros, and the audited expenditure in this low value part of the population was 373,000 euros. This is the moment where you have to decide if you want to use mean per unit or ratio estimation. If this is under the current programming period, you really have to do this check. It's not a free choice. For the next programming period, you can avoid to do this check if you automatically decide to use ratio estimation. If you prefer to use mean per unit estimation, you are completely free to use it, but you should just check based on the sample data that this condition does not hold. I mean, if this ratio covariance between errors and expenditure divided by the variance of book values is smaller or equal half of the error rate, in that case, you should use mean per unit estimation. It will be a more efficient method and you are welcome to do so. But if you decide automatically to use ratio estimation, no additional confirmation needs to be given. So let's assume for this example that we have decided to use ratio estimation, okay? So after auditing the sample, we have to project the errors. How? Well, errors found, errors projected in the high value stratum is 0, no errors were found. And in the low value stratum, I found these errors of 4,000 euros out of this audited expenditure of 673,000. So this is my error rate in the sample. And if I multiply the error rate in the sample by the declared expenditure, as you know, I will get the projected error, which is 18,000 euros. And final step, there is no room to calculate precision or upper error limit. I will just compare these 18,000 euros of projected error with the tolerable error, which is 2% of the declared expenditure. And of course, 18,000 euros is much smaller than 208,000 euros. So our projected error is much significantly below the materiality threshold. And this means that based on this information, we would conclude that the population does not contain material error, but without again controlling the audit risk. Now, regarding this, most of these principles are still applicable for the post-2020, the principles themselves, how to select the samples, how to project the errors, all many of these details. The two most important changes are the threshold for non-statistical sampling and the minimum coverage of the sample. As you know, for the post-2020, the threshold has changed from a range to a fixed value, and this fixed value is 300 population units, okay? So below 300 population units, you may use statistical sampling. By the way, the word may here is very important. You, of course, are extremely welcomed to use statistical sampling for any population size. There, let's say, from the technical point of view, you can use statistical sampling for any population size. The only possibility that the Commission is opening here is that saying that for populations with less than 300 units, tend to consider that the effort of statistical sampling in probably several cases or many cases can be a little bit disproportionate in relation to the importance of this population, and because of that you are allowed automatically to use non-statistical sampling. Again, as before, the sample has to be sufficient to draw a valid audit opinion, and in practical terms this means that we still have now a guideline for coverage, and the coverage no longer requires the rule no longer requires any coverage in terms of expenditure, only requires coverage in terms of sampling units. And the rule is that the minimum coverage for a non-statistical sampling is 10% of the sampling units in the population. Okay, again, ladies and gentlemen, at least at this moment, the Commission has not produced any table like the one we had in the previous programming period, where we have recommended you some updated thresholds for category 2, 3, and 4 system. At this moment, the Commission is just stating the minimum coverage is 10%, and then, of course, you should adapt based on your professional judgment. You should freely adapt this coverage, take into consideration the categorization of your system, the risk of this population. But at this moment, this is up to your professional judgment how to implement this increase in the coverage. Another point, which is, I think, very much obvious, but it's important to stress because it may create some doubts. If you have an exhaustive stratum, in any case, you decided that there are 2 units that you really want to audit and you have placed in this exhaustive stratum, this exhaustive stratum counts for the calculation of the 10% of minimum of coverage, okay? So the coverage is using the full sample, including the parts of the sample that may come from exhaustive verification of parts of the population. Again, as I said before, the use of non-statistical sampling for populations below 300 units is not mandatory at all. You may always decide to apply statistical sampling. Another important note, if in the beginning of a programming period, your population is below this threshold, you have a population of 100 operations and you want to apply non-statistical sampling. But if in a certain moment in the programming period, your population rises above 300 units, of course, that immediately, as soon as this happens, you should change for statistical sampling. Okay, so having started with non-statistical is no reason to continue to use non-statistical in the future. The same thing happens within one accounting year. I mean, if within one accounting year you are using a multi-period approach, and at the beginning of the year you are expecting to have a population with less than 300 units, and you plan everything to have a non-statistical sample, but after the second period or the third period of auditing the year, you realize that your population size is in fact above 300 units, in that case, you have to change to statistical sampling within this accounting year. Wow, there is something important to say. Although you are changing from non-statistical to statistical sampling, the sample that you have already selected in the previous periods of the year under non-statistical approach may still be used. Of course, why? Because fortunately, the units in any non-statistical sample are still selecting using probabilities, either equal selection or MUS selection. Because they have been selected probabilistically, there is no problem now in converting this previous sample that originally we have thought to be non-statistical into a part of a new statistical sample. No problem at all. The opposite pattern may also happen, ladies and gentlemen. If within an accounting year, under this multi-period approach, you expect to have a population larger than 300 units, and you select the sample size of the first period using a statistical method, but after the second or the third period, you realize that by the end of the year, your population will be below 300, you can also decide, if you would like, it's optional for you, you can also decide to change still within this accounting year your method for a non-statistical method. And again, the part of the sample that has already been audited in the previous period of the year will be part of the final non-statistical sampling, because it does not matter, both of them have been selected with a probabilistic approach. Any case, if you change the method from statistical into non-statistical, also I believe needless to say, but of course that the minimum coverage of the 10% of the sampling units will be based on the whole accounting year. And so the work that you have already done in the previous period already counts for reaching this threshold. May even happen that the sample that you have already audited in the first period already covers 10% of the population units, and this threshold is already reached. If this is the case, you still have to select some items for the new period within the year, because all the units in the population must have some probability to be selected to the sample, but you don't need to care anymore about the coverage, because the coverage is already reached. Some additional focus on the changes for the post-2020. This is last slide, and then we'll have time for discussion. Just to stress and underline something that I have already said many times. We have a delegated act that also covers non-statistical sampling. Because new delegated act has been restricted to simple random sampling and MUS, of course, that it's of no surprise that also on the side of non-statistical sampling, the methods that are covered are the same. So non-statistical sampling with equal probability, like in simple random sampling, and non-statistical sampling with probability proportional to expenditure, like in standard MUS. But let's say, basically for non-statistical sampling, besides the thresholds in the methodology itself, there are no changes foreseen in comparison to the current ending programming period, which means that everything that I have presented you here is still valid for the post-2020. Okay, and that's it about non-statistical sampling. And again, now some time for questions. I will check at the chat tool, but in the meantime, please do not hesitate to raise your hands, open your microphones to put any questions. What would you recommend if I plan to group all the new programming periods with use of non-statistical sampling, where the population for both programs consists of 250 items? My concern is that someone could later challenge the use of non-statistical method with reference to the requirements set for the programming period 1420 and the threshold of 150. Yes, this question is, can we, under this non-statistical sampling approach, combine two different programming periods? And if we combine, which rules should we use? Well, in this regard, Ms. Barbara Koschak, could you advise us?
Yes, I understand. There is some echo. I don't know whether well, in case of non-statistical, the grouping concerns statistical sampling. So in case the question concerns grouping of non-statistical sampling, please carry it separately according to rules of the programming periods. In case you make statistical sampling, then you come under the possible capping of fifth and grouping possibilities.
Just to clarify, to be sure, the question here is not about capping, but it's just to be sure, can we group two programming periods using non-statistical sampling? Barbara?
Okay, so if I understand well, it is still grouping of non-statistical sampling, yes?
I think so. I think the question is, if I group two accounting years of two periods, can I do this grouping under non-statistical sampling?
No, so grouping concerns also only statistical sampling.
Statistical sampling.
And
But Iri Pezina that ask is raising the hand, so maybe you can better clarify your question. Yes? We don't hear you. No. No sound?
in case there would be the situation that the common population for two programming period is below, in case it is, you can always do statistical sampling covering two programming periods, regardless of the population size in reality. But in case you'd like to do non-statistical sampling, then you simply have to do separately programming period by programming period.
Okay, I think it was extremely clear. These possibilities for statistical sampling. Iri Pezin is trying to connect wide audio. Can you? I don't think we hear you and still. Okay, no sound, but you understand. Many things. Okay, thank you. Greek Audit Authority, in case of slide 78, 79, the same sample selection approach should be applied for the two periods, 78, 79. It's a good point. No, not necessarily. The question is, imagine that during the accounting year, you want to change from non-statistical to statistical sampling, or vice versa, from statistical to non-statistical sampling. Can you change the sampling method? So before you are using equal probability selection and now you want to use probability proportional to expanded or something like that? Yes, you can perfectly do that. Nevertheless, we have to advise you that whenever within the same accounting year, you are using different sampling methods in different stratum or different periods, this is perfectly acceptable. It may make perfect sense, but then you have to be very careful when projecting errors, because then there is no template specifically designed for your situation, and you have to adapt the templates yourselves to consider that in one period you are projecting with some, let's say, imagine ratio estimation, and in the other period you are using the formulas from MUS, but besides that detail, the attention that you have to give to that, this is perfectly possible. Just more confusing, let's say. Can we use exhaustive stratum sample selected in the first period through non-statistical sampling for the second period? If in the second period we have to use statistical sampling and the sample in the first period, exhaustive stratum is not selected through EPS or PPS. So let me see if I understand. In the first period, you have used statistical sampling, and you have decided to implement an exhaustive stratum by design. Okay, and in the second period, you decide to change to non-statistical sample. And the question is, can you still use the sample of the exhaustive stratum for the first period? So if I have not interpreted correctly, please correct me. Yes, I would say yes, you can use all the sample from the previous period, and you are free to design exhaustive stratum that are not purely high value based on high value items, but are based on other criteria. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excuse me, can you hear me? The question was the other way around. If in the first period I have non-statistical, and in the second period I realized I have to use statistical, but the sample from the first period was not selected probabilistically through EPS or EPS. It was just by design. Can I use that sample for the statistical?
Look, there may be here a confusion.
Mhm.
It's an impossible scenario. It's not possible that in the first period, all your sample has to be selected by design.
No.
There is
not-
always a part of the sample that has been selected randomly. Okay, yes. The answer is
Okay.
yes. Of course, for majority of reason even, the full sample that you have been used in the first semester can be used for the whole statistical approach of the year. In fact, there will be an exhaustive stratum, but the existence of exhaustive stratum is perfectly compatible with statistical approaches, no problem at all.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Okay. For non-statistical sampling is the minimum coverage of 10% for the number of operations in the population or value of the total population. So I think we know this 10% is for the number of items, not for the expenditure, if I understand the question. 12 and 36, how do you divide according to the amount in half? No, to be honest, it's very much arbitrary. You can do as you please. What usually is the case? How to put your threshold? Because usually these populations of statistical sampling for non-statistical sampling are relatively small, it's relatively easy for you to look at the file of the operations. I have 48 operations, and to try to see, you can even do a graph or something like this, and you try to see if there is a gap somewhere, if there is a clearly a frontier between some items that stand out in terms of expenditure and other items that have significantly smaller expenditure. I understand that sometimes this is in a continuum and there is not a clear gap. And if it's not, it's up to you to put the border wherever you consider appropriate, okay? It's just based on professional judgment, but I always advise you to look at the data, to try to do a graph with the expenditures of the items just to guide you in this choice. Are the 6 of 12 chosen randomly? Yes, Patrick, yes, very much. They have to be chosen randomly, either with equal probabilities or probability proportional to expenditure, because if you don't do that, there would be some items out of the 12 that would have 0 chance to be selected to the sample, and that is not possible. All the items in the population must have some chance to be selected to the sample. For non-statistical sampling, it's also mandatory to project the sampling rate of error instead of the average unit error. No, not at all. By the way, it's never mandatory. The only thing that we have said is the following. If we use ratio estimation, it's covered in the delegated act, so you have a legal coverage, so you don't need to prove anything. If you use mean per unit estimation, which sometimes it's highly recommendable, okay, of course, that you just should prove based on this condition that you are under the conditions of having mean per unit estimation as an adequate method. And I think we have covered all your questions. Any additional comments or questions? So, let's still, before the lunch break, cover something else that is very important for both programming periods, which is unilateral approach. Ladies and gentlemen, please take into consideration that in what regards unilateral approach, there are no changes. So what I'm going to present to you, it's just a reminder of what this is. And this reminder is true both for the previous and the post-2020 programming periods. So you know that reaching a conclusion in terms of, in the context of statistical sampling, reaching a conclusion in terms of having or not material error in the expenditure is based on producing what we call a confidence interval. A confidence interval is the interval that contains the true level of error in the population with a probability that we call the confidence level. And this confidence level very typically ranges from 60 to 90% in line with the classification of your control system. Until some time ago, the only confidence intervals that we would use in the context of audit of operations would be what we could call the bilateral confidence intervals. What is a bilateral confidence interval? Well, it's a confidence interval that has a lower error limit and an upper error limit. So typical interval like this, my error rate is between 1% and 1.4%. This is the traditional bilateral interval. You can say that you are 90% sure that the true error rate is neither smaller than 1% nor above 1. Although this is a traditional way to do it, it's still true that very much in our approach to the audit of operations, we do not use so much the lower error limit. We don't care because in practice, to issue an opinion or to verify if the population contains or not material error, you basically compare both the projected error and the upper error limit with materiality threshold. Saying this and thinking a little bit that the lower error limit in practical terms is not of importance for us, we have opened some years ago the possibility to use what we call unilateral approach or unilateral testing. What is the unilateral approach? Is the idea to produce a confidence interval for the level of error in the population that has no lower error limit. We don't know the minimum. So, well, because in our context, we don't use negative errors, the very minimum would be 0, to be honest, isn't it? So basically, an alternative confidence interval to this one is an alternative where we don't have any minimum and you have a certain upper error limit, for example, 1.3%. So what is the difference reading these two alternative intervals? First one, I say, I'm 90% sure that the true error rate is somewhere between 1 and 1.4%. In the second case, I just state, I'm 90% sure that the true error rate is below 1.3%. How much below, I don't know, can be even 0. I'm not producing a lower error limit. So in the traditional bilateral approach, the confidence level is associated with probability that the error is between the lower error limit and the upper error limit. With the unilateral approach, the confidence level is associated with the probability that the error is below the upper error limit, but without knowing anything about the lower error limit. And in both cases, the interpretation of the confidence level is exactly the same, is the probability that the confidence interval contains the true level of error in the population. What does it mean in practical terms? In practical terms, this is extremely simple. In practical terms, it means that the use of unilateral approach may have an impact on the calculation of the sample size, as you are going to see, on the calculation of the precision, or both. And this is purely driven by changing the Z parameter from the normal distribution, from a Z parameter from a bilateral approach to a Z parameter for a unilateral approach, okay? So for the same level, for the same confidence level, I have the traditional Z value for bilateral approach and the new Z value for the unilateral approach that, as you suspect or know, it's smaller than the Z value of the bilateral approach. Why is this relevant for us? This is relevant for us because the use of the unilateral approach may help you to do one of two things. To be honest, personally, I don't advise one of the things, but the other is perfectly acceptable. The first thing is that you could use this reduced Z value to reduce the sample size under unilateral testing. Another option is to use the Z value to recalculate the precision after the sample is audited and after the results are projected to the population. And in any case, this is performed just by changing the Z value from the bilateral value into the unilateral value. So just this, if you have a category, let's say, if 3 system with a confidence level of 80%, and the bilateral approach, you would use both for sample size calculation and precision calculation a Z value of 1.282, and for under the unilateral approach of 0.842. These two ways of benefiting from the reduced Z value are completely different. One is to say, in the formulas for sample size calculation, let's use this reduced Z value, and with this, we may obtain a smaller sample size. A completely different alternative, but yet very relevant, is to say, no, I'm just profiting from this reduced Z value when projecting the errors to calculate the reduced precision, because the formula for precision calculation, depending on the sampling method that you use, always use this Z value. What is important for me to state at this moment? I would very much say that the unilateral approach is meant for the second alternative. Why? Unilateral approach is something that we have designed for situations where you have inconclusive results and where you would like to try to see if the results can be considered conclusive without any additional work. Example, you have a projected error of 1.5% and an upper error limit of 2.2%. Let's say, based on these results would be inconclusive because you don't know if the error is below or above materiality. But by the end of the audit, if by using this unilateral approach that is still acceptable, you are able to reduce the upper error limit from 2.2 to 1.9, then you can safely conclude that the population does not contain material error without performing any additional work. So this is very useful, but it's mostly a tool to try to check if your results can still be considered conclusive. What is the problem of using Z value in the very beginning before the audit for sample size calculation? The problem of using Z value is that it has not been sought for that. And if you use at the very beginning to obtain a reduced sample size, you will automatically eliminate from the very beginning this buffer that you have to make results conclusive if your upper error limit is above 2%. If you save this feature to the end, and if you have bad luck and your results upper error limit above 2%, you can use this to still reduce it. If from the very beginning you already calculate your sample size with the reduced Z value, you are going already to spend this, to use this shot, and by the end of the day, you don't have any additional buffer to try to make results conclusive. So just in philosophical terms, on the left I have the bilateral approach and on the right I have the unilateral approach. Just to be completely clear, under bilateral approach, we establish a certain lower error limit and then a certain upper error limit for the unilateral approach. We just know that the error amount or error weight is between 0 and a certain upper error limit, but let's say we don't care so much about the lower error limit. The bilateral approach is based on using both tails of the normal distribution. Unilateral approach is to concentrate our focus just over one tail of the normal distribution. Just to be absolutely clear that this works, and just to show you a simulation, we have done a simulation with for a population with an error rate of 1.33% under MUS, and we have performed 1,000 different samples, and we have analyzed different results from this. And first of all, about calculation of the sample size. How much sample size did we get using both bilateral and unilateral approach, depending on the confidence level that you use, ranging from 60 to 90%. These were the sample sizes. Follow me, ladies and gentlemen. If you use the traditional bilateral approach, and if you have a category 1 system, the sample size would be 26, but you already know that the very minimum is 30, so it would be 30. And then category 2 system, 40, 60, and 99. If in the very beginning you would use the unilateral approach, your sample sizes could be significantly reduced. Well, for category 1, no, because it's still 30. For the category 2, the reduction is not so significant because it's from 40 to 30. For category 3 is already significant, from 60 to 30, and for category 4 from 99 to 60. So this is a possibility, but again, I remind you that if you use this possibility at the very beginning, you lose then the opportunity by the end to use this to make results conclusive. Now, let me illustrate exactly the other way to use the reduced set value. Imagine that I am here. I have a 90% confidence level. I'm using a sample size of 99. Well, to facilitate, I have rounded to 100, okay? I have used a sample size of 100 operations with this confidence level of 90. What happened? First of all, I have calculated the sample size using the bilateral approach, which is what I have recommended. And based on this, I calculated the precision. And of course, because in the precision, the Z value appears somewhere in the formula, needless to say, but I have quantified here that the precision is smaller, it's better under unilateral approach. For bilateral approach, it was 0.70, and under unilateral, 0.55. Why is this relevant? This is relevant because of this. If we have calculated this sample size like this, it would happen the following. My confidence interval under the traditional bilateral approach would be between, let's say, rounding 0.7% and 2.1%. So the upper error limit will breach the materiality threshold, and we could say the results are not fully conclusive. Nevertheless, if I find myself in this situation by the end of the audit, and I have not yet spent this opportunity of the Z value, I can now, by the end of the audit, recalculate the upper error limit under the assumption of the unilateral approach, I mean under the reduced Z value, and automatically I have reduced my upper error limit to 1.9%, and now I have fully conclusive results, and no additional analysis, no additional work would be needed for this case, okay? In both cases, this is correct. In both cases, we know that we are 90% sure. In first case, we are 95% sure that the true error rate is somewhere between 0.65% and 2.05. In the second case, I'm 95% sure that the true error rate is below 1.9%, but I don't know the lower error limit. And we have also seen by extensive testing that the coverage rates of these confidence intervals, in fact, correspond to the confidence levels. For instance, in bilateral testing with simulation, we confirm that the coverage is 91% and unilateral testing 90%, which is fully in line with the confidence level that we have used, and the conclusion is that both methods are able to produce correct confidence intervals. Just last slide to state that for the post-2020, as I said in the very beginning of the morning, no changes are foreseen, and you still have this possibility of using the unilateral approach as a tool to reduce the upper error limit if you have an upper error limit above 2%. Okay, this ends this chapter, and again, time for some questions before lunch. How would you reduce the upper error limit from 2.2 to 1.9? Well, just because here in the formula, instead of using a Z value of 1645, instead of using a Z value of 1645, I have used a new Z value of 1.282. So, of course, by multiplying the precision to the other components of precision by a smaller Z value, the precision will be smaller. And as you remember, the upper error limit is just equal to the projected error plus the precision. So if I have a smaller precision, I will also have a smaller upper error limit. If the reduced Z value is used for the recalculation of the precision of 1 year, thus this reduced Z value has to be used in the following year when calculating the sample size as well, or is it possible to use the regular? Yes, of course, it's completely different. Each year is an independent exercise. This year you have just used the Z value in order to reduce precision and try to reinforce your belief, your professional judgment, your professional opinion that this population does not contain material error. This is something that has just been used with this purpose. For the next year, of course, I believe that you should, as much as possible, recalculate the sample size with the normal Z value for the bilateral approach. And again, by the end of the year is necessary, you still have this buffer to try to confirm that results are conclusive. Ladies and gentlemen, also needless to say, but I will say, if you have a category 1 or 2 system, and if you decide to apply a sample size of 50 or more under the simplified approach, you don't need to care about this unilateral approach, because whatever is the precision that you achieve and whatever is the upper error limit that you achieve, the Commission will accept the results of your audit. So this is only applicable for category 1 and 2 systems. If you have not audited the 50, or in general for category 3 or 4 systems, it's still necessary, of course, to prove this. And also for the CET, yes. Is it possible to use this unilateral approach for the agricultural funds? I think so everything that we are saying here, it's just mandatory for the funds that we are talking about. You have to ask the Agri, but I believe that it's not possible for the agricultural funds. Okay, and there is some reasoning and some reasons why the Agri, I believe, tends to consider that this is not possible, but I'm not sure. Yes, it is also possible to use this approach for the 14-20 period. Yes, it's already available. Good. Any additional question? No? So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Let's stop for lunch break, and you resume by 2:30 as planned. Okay? See you in the afternoon.